The first thing John noticed was the smell. It wasn't just sweat or disinfectant or rot. It was all of them layered together, a sour, metallic stench that clung to the back of his throat and refused to leave. It reminded him of wet pennies and spoiled meat, of something once alive that had been forgotten too long in the dark. Step forward, hands on the yellow line. Don't look around. The voice came from behind plexiglass, bored and sharp at the same time. John obeyed, boots scuffing against the concrete floor. He had been awake for 36 hours, arrest, holding cell, transport, paperwork, waiting, more waiting. Time had begun to lose its shape. He was 32 years old, 5'10", 178 pounds when he'd last checked, though he suspected that number would not hold for long. Brown hair, thinning slightly at the temples. No gang tattoos. No priors that involved violence. None of that seemed to matter now. A corrections officer pressed a button, and the inner door slid open with a hydraulic sigh. John stepped into the processing area of Greystone Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison built in 1974 for 1,200 inmates. It currently housed 2,843. Overcrowding was not mentioned in the intake brochure. Neither was the fact that Greystone had been operating under a federal investigation for 3 years, nor that 6 inmates had died there in the last 18 months. 2 officially ruled suicides, 1 heart failure, 3 listed as undetermined. John would become the 7th. John Miller was not innocent. That mattered to him, because guilt had weight, and he carried it carefully, like a glass object that could shatter if handled too roughly. He had been convicted of involuntary manslaughter, 1 punch outside a bar, a bad fall, a cracked skull against concrete, a moment of anger that lasted less than 2 seconds and ruined 2 lives forever. He had pled guilty. He had stood in court and listened as the judge read the sentence. 8 to 12 years. He remembered thinking that 12 years sounded survivable. Hard, but survivable. He remembered promising himself he would keep his head down, avoid trouble, do the programs, come out quieter and older but alive. He did not yet understand how overcrowding changes the math. "You're in C block," the officer said, flipping through a clipboard. "Cell C-17. Top bunks taken. Don't ask for a bottom. Everyone asks for a bottom." C block had been designed for 240 men. It held 612. John followed the officer down a corridor that hummed with noise, shouting, coughing, metal clanging against metal. Men lined the bars, some silent, some yelling obscenities, some staring with the flat, hungry eyes of people who had learned to assess threat and weakness in seconds. Cell C-17 was 8 by 10 feet. Inside were 3 men. "You're the 4th, the officer said. "Congratulations." There were 2 bunks welded to the wall, one above the other, and a thin mattress on the floor that looked permanently damp. A stainless steel toilet sat in the corner. No seat, no privacy barrier. The men inside turned to look at him. One was old, skin like parchment, eyes bloodshot. Another was massive, his arms corded with muscle and scars. The third was thin and jittery, teeth chattering though the cell was warm. "Fresh meat," the big one said, smiling without humor. John swallowed. Overcrowding changed everything. It meant fewer guards per inmate. It meant longer lockdowns. It meant medical requests stacked so high they expired before being read. It meant fights broke out over inches of space, over looks, over breathing too loud. In C block, the unofficial rule was simple: survive. The big man's name was Marcus. He had been inside since he was 19 and was now 43. He controlled the cell. "You got commissary money?" Marcus asked that first night. "A little," John said. "Good. You'll contribute, or you'll suffer." The old man was Eli. He had liver disease and coughed blood into a rag at night. The jittery one was Tommy, serving time for burglary, withdrawing from something he couldn't name anymore. At night, John slept on the floor mattress. Rats scratched inside the walls. Somewhere down the block, someone screamed until the sound cut off abruptly. John learned not to ask why. It happened on day 12. John had failed to move fast enough during count. Marcus shoved him. John stumbled, hit the toilet, cracked his lip. "You disrespecting me?" Marcus asked. John shook his head. No. Marcus punched him anyway. The beating lasted less than a minute. When it was over, John lay curled on the concrete, ribs screaming, vision flickering. No guards came. None ever did unless blood pooled visibly. Tommy watched from the corner, eyes wide. Eli turned his face to the wall. That night, John cried silently, pressing his face into the mattress to muffle the sound. Trauma does not arrive all at once. It seeps. John filed a medical request for his ribs. It took 17 days to be seen. By then, the fractures had begun to heal incorrectly. Take ibuprofen, the nurse said, not meeting his eyes. Next, outside the infirmary, two men fought over a seat. A guard sprayed pepper spray into the crowd, without warning. John inhaled it, lungs burning, eyes streaming. He thought of his mother. He did not think of calling her. The riot started over bread. The kitchen had run out during dinner service. Trays came back half empty. Someone threw a chair. Someone else threw a fist. Within minutes, C Block was locked down. Men were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day. For men, 8 by 10 feet. No showers for a week. The toilet backed up. Eli's cough worsened. Tommy shook constantly. Marcus grew meaner. On the 5th day, Marcus decided John had not contributed enough. He slammed John's head against the wall. Something inside John changed then. Not broke, exactly, but shifted. A quiet part of him went dark. John wrote a letter he never sent. He wrote about the smell, the noise, the fear. He wrote, "I am disappearing in here." He folded it carefully and hid it inside his Bible. Tommy talked too much. In overcrowded prisons, information is currency. Tommy owed money. He whispered names to guards, thought it would buy him protection. It didn't. One night, they dragged him out of the cell. John heard the beating from down the tier. Tommy came back hours later, barely conscious, face swollen beyond recognition. "They'll kill me," Tommy whispered. Marcus said nothing. Tommy died 2 days later. Official cause, cardiac arrest. Unofficially, everyone knew. The body was removed on a gurney, covered by a sheet that did not hide the blood. That night, Marcus looked at John differently, calculating. John learned the truth from Eli. Eli had been a prison orderly once. He knew things. "They're moving bodies," Eli whispered, marking some as natural. "Keeps the numbers down. Keeps the funding steady." John stared at him. "You think Tommy was the first?" Eli coughed. "Or will be the last?" Something cold settled in John's chest. Marcus decided John was expendable. It happened during shower rotation. The cameras in that corridor had been broken for months. Marcus and 2 others cornered him. The beating was methodical. John tasted blood and iron in despair. He thought, this is how it ends. But it didn't. Not yet. John woke in his cell. Eli was dead. The old man lay still on the bottom bunk, eyes open, staring at nothing. A guard glanced in. "Another one," he muttered. "Cause of death, complications from liver disease." John screamed. Weeks later, a report would be filed. It would list overcrowding as a contributing factor. It would recommend further review. Nothing would change. Marcus came for John after lights out. The cell was silent. John did not fight back. He was too tired. When it was over, Marcus stepped back. John did not get up. John Miller was pronounced dead at 3:42 a.m. Cause of death, blunt force trauma complicated by pre-existing conditions. The guards wrote that they found him unresponsive. No charges were filed. The letter was found months later during a cell renovation. A volunteer read it. It reached the press. For a week, people were angry. Then the news cycle moved on. Greystone remained overcrowded. Some nights, inmates in C Block swear they hear someone coughing where Eli once slept. Others say they hear crying from a floor near the toilet. John's name is etched on a list few will read. But the echoes remain, because prisons do not just hold bodies, they consume them. And sometimes, they leave just enough behind for the world to pretend it never happened. Greystone did not mourn. The morning after John Miller's death began like every other. Buzzers, shouted orders, trays slid through slots. His body had already been removed, wheeled down the same corridor. where men still pressed their faces to the bars, watching with expressions that mixed fear, envy, and relief. An empty space remained on the floor of cell C-17. No one filled it immediately. In overcrowded prisons, space is precious, but death creates a temporary vacuum. Men avoid it for a day or two, as if the air itself might still carry whatever took the last occupant. Marcus sat on the lower bunk, silent. For the first time since anyone could remember, he did not speak. Within 48 hours, a new man arrived. His name was Daniel Ruiz, 24 years old. First offense, drug possession with intent to distribute. He stood where John once had, clutching his mattress, eyes wide as he took in the cell. Marcus looked at him. Something in his expression had changed, not softened, but dulled, like a blade that had struck bone one too many times. "Top bunk," Marcus said flatly. Daniel nodded quickly. The system moved on. John's death entered the system as data. A number in a spreadsheet, a paragraph in a report, a signature at the bottom of a form that few would ever read in full. The internal investigation lasted 6 days. They interviewed Marcus. He denied everything. They interviewed guards. None had seen anything. They reviewed camera footage that showed nothing, because there was nothing to show. Conclusion: no evidence of staff misconduct. Case closed. John's mother received the call at 6:17 a.m. A calm voice explained that there had been an incident, that her son had been found unresponsive, that attempts had been made. She dropped the phone. At the funeral, the casket was closed. She stood over it and whispered, "I'm sorry." Though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to, her son, or the version of the world she had believed in before the call. 3 months later, during routine renovations meant to address capacity optimization, workers removed the bunks in C-17. The Bible fell from the wall cavity. Inside it, folded and yellowed, was John's letter. The volunteer chaplain read it first. He read about the smell, the fear, the sentence that stopped him cold. "If I die in here, it won't be because of my crime. It will be because there are too many of us and not enough of them who care." A local paper ran the story. Inmate death raises questions about prison conditions. For a week, politicians spoke carefully. Advocates protested outside the gates. Hashtags trended. Then something else happened somewhere else, and attention shifted. Greystone remained full. Marcus began to unravel. Violence had always been his language, but now it came without purpose. Outbursts over nothing. Long stretches of silence punctuated by sudden rage. One night, he whispered John's name in his sleep. Another inmate heard him. Word spread. Weakness is dangerous in places like Greystone. It happened during rec time. Marcus swung first. The other man swung harder. By the time guards arrived, Marcus was on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. He survived, barely. Transferred to medical isolation, then to another facility. No one ever said why. Daniel found John's name carved faintly into the concrete near the toilet. He traced it with his finger. Who was he? Daniel asked one night. No one answered, but Daniel understood anyway. 6 months later, another man died in C Block. Different cell. Same reasons. Overcrowding. Neglect. Silence. The number on the spreadsheet increased by 1. John Miller's name appears nowhere on Greystone's memorial wall. There is no plaque, no apology, but his letter exists. Copied, shared, remembered by those who choose to look. Prisons are designed to contain people, but they also contain stories. Some are buried, some escape, and some, like John's, linger in the cracks, whispering a truth the walls cannot keep forever. That overcrowding is not an inconvenience. It is a weapon, and it rarely leaves fingerprints. The envelope arrived without a return address. It was thick, heavy with paper. Lena Hart almost threw it away. She had been a reporter for 14 years, long enough to recognize the difference between noise and something that refused to stay buried. The word Greystone written across the front stopped her. Inside were copies of internal memos, medical request logs, staffing schedules, and death certificates. 7 names were highlighted. John Miller was the last. Lena worked nights. She pinned documents to the wall of her apartment, connecting dates with red string like a cliché. she never thought she'd become. Every death followed the same rhythm. Overcapacity warnings ignored, medical requests unanswered, cameras malfunctioning in the same corridors, autopsies delayed, causes of death softened by language. She felt something cold settle behind her ribs. This wasn't negligence. It was design. The source agreed to meet only once. A diner off the highway. Neutral ground. He was a former correction sergeant. Early retirement. Hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They told us to write it a certain way, he said, stirring coffee he never drank. Use words like complications, pre-existing, never assault unless there's video. Why? Lena asked. Because deaths mean audits. Audits mean